Will and Nick and Councillor Swift, thank you very much. Absolutely thrilled to be here to chair this morning's first session on how to create strong towns. As Will said, my name is James O'Shaughnessy, and the reason I'm doing this is because I chair Onward's Social Fabric programme. It seems to me entirely fitting that we will be talking about how to restitch our social fabric here in Halifax, the epicentre of the region that created the actual fabric that powered the UK's emergence as an economic powerhouse. That won't be the first cloth-based pun that you hear today, I'm afraid. But the question we are investigating today is how we enable our towns to drive and share in the UK's re-emergence as a powerhouse. It is for that reason I'm absolutely delighted that we are able to welcome as our political keynote Lisa Nandy. Now, Lisa will be well known to you, I'm sure, as not only the Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, but just as importantly as the founder of the Centre for Towns and somebody whose leadership has put these issues on the political agenda. Lisa, we're here in a town and indeed a building which is undergoing its own renaissance, and we're looking forward to hearing how we can make Halifax's success story ring true across the UK. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks very much. Lovely, thanks very much. I mean, it's so great to be here today. I cannot tell you how many times I've spent over the last few years talking about towns, about people in towns, in major cities. And so full credit to Onward for bringing us to Halifax today and showing what can be done with the will, the imagination, the courage, the energy and the talent of people across this country. The question I was asked to answer today was how do we rebuild Britain's towns? But before I answer that question, I want to talk to you about why. Why should we? Many of you will have come here from major cities today. You might have travelled from Leeds, from London, from Manchester. You might not be as invested in rebuilding towns across Britain as I am. You may not have talked about towns so much that you've become a meme on social media to the tune of Britney Spears. You may even disagree that investing in towns is a central plank of how we build a new Britain. I know that some of you will be deeply invested in the idea, which has been so prevalent for so long, that only cities with the size and the scale that they afford can play a part in powering our economy. And you might recognise too the story that I'm about to tell you of a place that experienced huge growth in new industries and workplaces, trebling in size in just a few decades, as people moved there to seek work and higher salaries and career advancement, whose impact was then felt across the world, but where people struggled with soaring housing costs and extremes of inequality and overcrowding and pressure on public services. But that place wasn't Leeds or London or Manchester. It was here in Halifax in the 19th century, when this small market town became central to Britain's textile industry and an engine of Britain's economic growth. Back then, people didn't leave our towns for our cities. They left cities to find work in the mills, the mines, the factories in the towns of Britain. But over the course of my lifetime, that settlement has flipped. Every year, young people leave our towns looking for opportunity, for education, for work, for employment. And for those who want to, and some people will not, but for those who want to, so many of them can't find a way to get back. It's robbed places that were once the engine of British industry, of our working age population, and the spending power that came with secure, well-paid jobs, the jobs you could raise a family on. The scars of that are visible on our high streets, in the lost pubs and the banks and the post offices and the working men's clubs. Those institutions that the MP Jessie Norman once said shape and define us as we shape and define them. And everything flows from this, the cancelled bus networks that simply can't survive because they're commissioned on the basis of passenger numbers. The crisis of loneliness that has emerged in many towns around Britain amongst older people. It was no accident that it was my friend and badly missed colleague Jo Cox who set up the Loneliness Commission. Jo represented Batley and Spen, a series of small towns where young people too often have to get out in order to get on, and where too many people are now growing old hundreds of miles away from their children and their grandchildren. This was our inheritance, the pride, the purpose, the dignity that came from powering Britain and the contribution that we made taken from us. No wonder then the political revolt, the falling turnout, the dramatic rise in support for UKIP in many towns across Britain, the vote to leave the European Union, because a representative democracy that fails to provide representation to people on the things that matter most will command no legitimacy. This is the cause of these great waves of political upheaval that we've seen emerging in the United States, in France, in Germany, in Britain. These are the flames, as the academic Harry Pitts put it, that are licking at the sides of liberal democracy. And in France, responding to the tidal wave of discontent that had emerged outside of the major cities, President Macron said it is as if they have been forgotten, erased. This is 40 years of malaise that has risen to the surface. It goes back a long way, but it is here now. So that's why we should rebuild our towns, because writing off the contribution that whole people make threatens the legitimacy of our entire system. It has no place in a decent democracy, and it is no way to run a modern economy. But in Britain, that is precisely the approach that our system of government has taken. In 19 of the last 20 years, only 2 regions of this country raised more in revenue than the public spending they received. Only 2 regions outpaced average productivity. We are hugely, overly, catastrophically reliant on a few industries in a few corners of the country to do all of the heavy lifting, and it isn't just towns. For at least a century, most core cities have trailed way behind the capital. We're unique in that in a major economy, and it creates us a unique set of problems. We lack resilience. We saw the impact of that in 2008 with the global financial crash. And in the increasingly desperate search to boost productivity, we've continued to pile more and more investment into the places that already have it, where politicians hope that by doing so they'll get more bang for their buck, so that the places that were pulling further and further ahead continue to do so, while other places are allowed to pull further and further behind. This is presumably how you get the absurd scenario where South Yorkshire can be granted absolutely no money, 0, for its buses, while a young carer, Thomas Atkin in Sheffield, has to leave home at 6:30 every single morning to get the 2.5 miles to his school on time. He told the Sheffield Star, it's not working. He's right, Britain is not working. Even the winners are losing. Take London, where the high housing costs and overcrowding are holding back an entire generation. This is the region with the highest disposable income, bar none, that falls to the middle of the ranks once these crippling housing costs are taken into account. Strain on public services, congestion, air pollution. This is what happens when you undercook most of the British economy, you overheat the rest. Could we do better than this? You bet we could. For decades, too many places have been denied the investment and the backing to prosper. People and entire places written off. Behind this is the arrogant, dismissive belief that we don't have a contribution to make to the future of this country, but we do. Young people in Wigan, Barnsley, Aberdeen could power us through the next century like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last with the right backing. Spend time in any one of those communities and you will find a level of ambition that is dimmed by 40 years of relative economic decline. But we need a government that backs us, that matches that level of ambition, and that will support us to make that contribution to our national story. So I say this, that when the Conservatives quietly abandon levelling up, they aren't just abandoning an election pledge. They're abandoning the communities to who they promised so much 3 years ago. If you assume that only 2 regions have a role to play, if you believe that people should just move to find opportunity, if you really think that the way to boost productivity is to run down rights and sweat your existing workforce harder, you will always and inevitably write people off. 50 years ago, the trade unionist Jimmy Reid, in a speech whose resonance was to echo through successive decades, told students at Glasgow University, I am convinced that the great mass of people go through life without even a glimmer of what they could have contributed to their fellow human beings. This is a personal tragedy. It is a social crime. He went on to urge the students to reject these attitudes. A rat race, he said, is for rats. So the next Labour government will reject this approach, and we will work with our communities to empower them and their leaders to rebuild Britain from the ground up, bringing good, well-paid, secure jobs back to communities that's lost them and giving people the tools to make the decisions that affect their lives. We share that enormous ambition that people in every part of this country have for themselves, their families, their communities, and their country, and we'll match it. So first, we'll depart from the Treasury orthodoxy, the orthodoxy which explains why we're currently trying to do levelling up on the cheap, handing us back £1 for every £13 they've taken from us in the last decade, that only 2 regions of the UK have a contribution to make. We'll depart from that approach, we'll get Britain working again. And Rachel Reeves has committed that the next Labour government will invest £28 billion a year, every year for a decade, to bring good jobs back to our coastal and industrial towns. There is a global race on to create these jobs of the future, and we will invest to bring them here. Batteries for electric cars, offshore wind, hydrogen, solar, drawing on the strengths and the assets in many of our towns across Britain, and support the creation of 100,000 new startups across the country. Because for too long, and this is true of my party as much as it's true of any other part of the political system, there's been an assumption that there's a trade-off between net zero and good jobs. But the road to net zero is paved with 1 million jobs. Those jobs are being created all over the world. Why not here? And I'll say more than that net zero is a central question of social justice. I saw it here in Halifax a few years ago when I visited a cafe owner whose business is now frequently hit by floods that cripple her livelihood. People's homes underwater every year for years and years and years, and so little action is taken. And for those of us who believe in social justice, for those of us who believe that people have the right to that secure, larger, richer, more dignified life, I say that this is a central question of social justice because it's working class people here and around the world who have most at stake and most to lose if we don't get this right. Homes, businesses, jobs, savings, pensions, all invested in fossil fuels. We've got to take action now. And that's why we call this jobs commitment a climate investment pledge, because regeneration and decarbonisation work hand in hand so that towns like Halifax have a secure future in every sense. And we'll take a place-based approach to rebuilding, not just looking at the gap between regions, but investing in our cities and our towns so that every part of Britain can contribute. But I'll say this too to you, that just as we reject the idea that Britain can be powered from 2 regions alone, we reject the idea that a rising tide in Leeds or Manchester in London automatically lifts all boats. There is a wealth of evidence from Diane Coyle to Andy Pike and others that the evidence does not support this. But it does support the fact that power closer to home, where people can see the assets and the potential in their communities, not just the problems, is a key part of creating jobs and growth and regeneration. So we'll end the Hunger Games style system where West Yorkshire is pitted against South Yorkshire and where Leeds is pitted against Wakefield, the winners and losers that Michael Sandel talked about, in a system that doesn't just create more losers than it creates winners, but rigs the system so that the losers simply can't win. Why should kids growing up in Grimsby be denied the bus service that connects them to game-changing jobs on the Grimsby docks, while a kid growing up in Bolton can get the bus she needs to an apprenticeship simply because a politician in Whitehall has deemed that one set of politicians are worthy of greater powers than others? We've always known in the north of England that we raise people up together. We do things differently here. Secondly, it's an article of faith for us that people have the right to determine their own governance arrangements. There's a long history in Britain of people rejecting top-down structures that are imposed on them without consent. And if we learn anything from Brexit, it's surely that people must consent to their own governance in a democracy worth its salt. But sadly, it seems not everybody has learned this lesson. The Levelling Up Bill that has just been put before Parliament dangles the prospect of a few extra powers, but only for those who consent to a mayor and those who meet the Chancellor's approval as a functional economic unit. We believe in governance that reflects the realities of geography and identity and economics based on the principle of consent. The Prime Minister, 2 years ago, made an offer to communities across Britain to come to him and tell him what powers we need. Whether it's a hotel bed tax in Birmingham or Manchester, the skills or the buses in Stoke or Grimsby, our offer is that when you do so, our doors and our minds will be open. So we'll equip local leaders with the powers that they need to connect people up to jobs and opportunities and apprenticeships and invest in the skills of our people so that we're not just moving a handful of jobs to Darlington or Leeds, but we're creating that pipeline for young people in those places to get them. But there's one missing element in this conversation about mayors and councils and local enterprise partnerships and combined authorities, and it's the people. So thirdly, we believe that if people drive outcomes and share in decision-making, they make better decisions, and those decisions last. The lesson of the last Labour government, 13 years of investment, is that the sure starts that are designed, conceived and funded from Whitehall can be abolished at one stroke of a pen, but the community energy partnerships that grew up across the country, co-owned and run by hundreds of local people, will survive. So whether it's the pioneering work on participatory budgeting in Madrid, or people taking the reins in Wigan through the Wigan deal, the evidence base suggests that this works, both in growing trust and legitimacy and ensuring that decision makers become more agile, changing and evolving in order to make things work for most people. So we're exploring how we can enshrine the community's right to be consulted, to co-produce services and participate in budgeting into law. Because if I've learned anything in the last decade, it's that those with skin in the game do more, they try harder, they work for longer, and they think more creatively about how to solve the problems in front of them. And the best way to get good outcomes is to empower the people with the most at stake. But as I learned when we fought a very long and hard battle to save Wigan Football Club, rights alone aren't enough unless you can use them. And what we lacked, what communities so often lack, is assets. So you have the right to buy your football club, but only if you happen to have a spare few million quid lying around down the back of the sofa. So fourth, we're working on a plan for how we can build assets in communities, for communities, drawing inspiration from work that is happening in Grimsby and in Preston, and supporting institutions that are built by the people, for the people, and used to protect the things that we have in common. Like the Halifax Permanent Building Society, which emerged out of the working class men and women of the textile mills who clubbed together to buy land and build houses and invested their savings for the express purpose of helping other people to do the same. An organisation that began with just 3 members in a local pub that by the 1920s had assets worth over 47 million, supporting people across Yorkshire and the UK, financing over 14,000 homes. These are the things we hold in common that matter to us, that define us. And we stand here today as part of the Peace Hall regeneration, rebuilt from the ashes, but for too many communities, we've been forced to watch as those assets, those things that we most value, were allowed to wither and decay and collapse. So my message to those of you who care about those things, who want to protect us, is we will not be indifferent and we will not stand aside. Fifthly, because these are the people who will rebuild Britain from the ground up, and we must back them. And that means central government stopping trying to do their jobs, micromanaging millions of decisions that properly belong to our communities, and starting to do its job instead, standing up for the interests of people again, taking the global action we need to tackle climate change, reaching agreement to stop a race to the bottom, like the global minimum corporation tax, which President Biden pioneered, that puts money back into our communities. So when a handful of people who have never set foot in our towns and cities buy up housing stock and let it go to rack and ruin, we will act. When they milk the system using money we pay in through housing benefit to turn a profit, when they extract and destroy when others are trying to create and invest, central government has to back our people, clamping down on the loopholes and lack of standards that allow this to continue. For years, we've called on government to make it easier for councils to reclaim public spaces and turn them to productive use. So we welcome tentative steps from the government on this, but we think it can go further. To prevent foreign buy-up of housing stock and town centres, to make the compensation rules fairer for councils, taking back the land they need for housing and to rebuild our town centres. And 5 full years after one of the most shocking tragedies of modern times at Grenfell, we must finally get on top of leaseholder reform to end arcane rules and give tenants a say over their own communities, and reform local government finance to bring back autonomy and long-term planning to areas that are crying out for it and have been crying out for it for decades. So this is it, the how and the why of building back strong towns. How? More powers, more say for people with fewer preconditions, less bureaucratic hurdles. Trust and respect are the principles that will guide us. To win the race for clean energy jobs, to invest in the transport, the digital and the skills infrastructure, so young people have choices and chances and don't have to get out to get on. So that people have money back in their pockets again and can spend in local shops and businesses and community assets they have a stake in. High streets and town centres that thrive not because of a lick of paint, a small grant here and there to paper over the cracks, but because the local economy is thriving, where everyone can contribute and nobody is written off. That's the how, but what's the why? Because this is a country that was founded and forged by the work in our towns. And yet here we are in 2022 with 1,000 years of British history collapsed into a discussion about a handful of functional economic areas determined by the Treasury. Let's not confine our future to that vision. We should be a thriving network again of great villages, towns and cities in all of its glorious diversity. Not everywhere is the same, and nor should we be, where the choices and chances for someone growing up in Barnsley can mean as much to the national endeavour as somebody growing up in Manchester, where geography, as someone once said, is no longer destiny. This is the country that George Orwell, who's forever associated with my town in Wigan through the road to Wigan Pier, said is only just beneath the surface. And, he said, it is time to take charge of our own destiny, to see Britain into the next generation, strong and confident in the world. We must be stronger than the sum of all our parts, where every place has the right and the opportunity to contribute. To see that realised, you have to lift up every bit of this country. It must be a country of 1,000 success stories like the one unfolding here in Halifax. This is why you tilt power back to the people who invest and create and build. This is how you rebuild Britain from the ground up. This is the country that I've believed in all my life and never yet seen. And I want to say to Onward and to all of you who will come from many political traditions and none, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation with you here today, because this is a task, a mission that doesn't belong to any one place, doesn't belong to any one group, doesn't belong to any one political party. It is the challenge of our generation. It's a challenge like no other that I've tried to confront in my lifetime, but there is no alternative path for this country. We move forwards and we do it the only way that counts. We do it together. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you for a very thoughtful, a comprehensive, a sometimes provocative speech. Speaking as a Conservative, I'm delighted that this is going to be the political battleground that the parties will fight over, because, as you say, this matters whoever's in charge. This has to be the agenda for the future of our country. We're going to have time for questions, so ready yourselves. I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege, though, to get in there first, and I will call on the audience in a moment. You talked about towns powering us through the next century, but you also talked of 40 years of malaise. It's not like other governments haven't tried this. You talked about New Labour. Think about some of the initiatives in the 1990s to get that urban regeneration going. I think we can say they have not comprehensively succeeded. So what's going to be different this time with the Labour government?
I think the problem that we've confronted over lots of piecemeal and often well-intentioned attempts to try to rebuild the fabric of our great towns and of regional development and all of the different initiatives that we've had has been a view that really, in the end, this is about supporting people, about managing decline, about trying to boost individuals in places to be able to move and to get opportunities and to get good jobs. And what we haven't had is a comprehensive assessment of the damage that that's doing to our national effort. It's a country that is this unequal, that relies so solely on the talents and the contribution of a few people in a few places, just simply cannot thrive. That's the view I came to after spending a lot of time thinking about this as somebody who was actually born in Manchester in 1979, the year that Margaret Thatcher came to power, grew up in Bury in Lancashire and made my home in Wigan, a town that used to be far, far younger than the ageing city nearby, but has seen that contribution written off and erased, and those secure jobs down the mines replaced by low-paid, insecure work. I came to see so clearly how that was holding the whole country back, not just part of it, and that if we're going to be bigger than the sum of our parts, then we need to invest in all our parts. So I think that's the opportunity, because there are people in all political parties who haven't come to that conclusion. There's certainly people in the government, the current government and the cabinet, who haven't. But there are also people in every political party now who've come to see this. You told me 12 years ago when I was elected as the MP for Wigan that we would be sitting here having this conversation right now, I wouldn't have believed it. We've come a long way, but there is a moment now, a small moment, and that window is closing, where there is the potential for a political consensus that will start to draw on the talents and the strengths of every part of this country again. And that's why I say we've got to seize it.
Very good, thank you. I mean, just one thing I wanted to pick up on as well is there's a very sort of economic flavour to the speech you gave, and indeed in your essay in this excellent pamphlet, if you haven't read it, you take what I might call a sort of jobs first approach. Our research at Onward has said, of course, economics matters, of course, good transport infrastructure and so on matters, but so do good relationships, so do civic institutions, so do strong positive norms like low crime and so on. So it's not just jobs, is it? Or do you think you have to start with jobs?
So I think jobs is at the core of what Levelling Up is about. Those good, well-paid, secure jobs, because they provide not just the economic basis for many places around the country, but they also provide the sense of pride, purpose, contribution and dignity that you've been discussing at this conference over the last week. Those things matter. They matter because then people have a stake in the national story, they have a role to play, and they're recognised as such. That's why when we set up Centre for Towns a few years ago, we wanted to go and spend a bit of time in towns asking people what the agenda should look like. We thought they would talk about Brexit. It was at the height of the Brexit wars, and in Westminster nobody could talk about anything else. It didn't come up once. The thing that came up first and foremost everywhere we went was transport. And that was largely because we were speaking to fairly empty rooms because most people simply couldn't get there. And for those people who had got there, they'd had, as many of you will have done today, they'd had a real struggle to get the buses and the trains that they needed to get there. But the second thing that came up almost everywhere we went was arts and culture. Because it turned out that the way that the Arts Council had been funding arts and culture through institutions had meant that as many of those institutions were lost in our towns, in part because of the lack of secure, decent work and wages, that meant that they'd become less sustainable. Large swathes of the country had become deserts for arts funding, and people had found themselves written out of the national story. So I guess I would just say to you that this is not an either-or. The two things absolutely go hand in hand. But the thing that we have in our towns in abundance is those relationships and those assets and those strengths. That's why Wigan could pioneer the Wigan deal, because it's the sort of town where people know each other, they look after each other. My street is not unusual in having 3 generations of one family living at each end. And because we've got those social assets, we can draw on them when times are tough, and we always have. But what we've lacked is the investment and the support to be able to make that economic contribution as well.
Thank you. Now, if I can take questions from the audience, if you could put your hands up, say who you are, and keep your questions brief, that would be welcome. I saw one hand pop up at the back, so please, yes.
I don't know if everyone heard that, but it was about whether, as part of that sort of greater devolution and giving people more of a stake and more of a say, we're planning to devolve tax raising powers. It's something that we've kick-started a conversation on with local areas, whether that's through the council leaders, the mayors in the combined authorities, the Welsh Government. We're learning quite a lot from the approach that Mark Drakeford and Vaughan have taken over in Wales. And we've kick-started a conversation about what people need, because we think in the end that if you're going to get this right for places, then you have to rebuild from the ground up. And that means that the conversation has to start there with what people need. So to give you an example, Manchester this week or last week has brought in a tourist levy, a hotel bed tax, because they know that they can raise significant amounts of revenue from doing so, and they can reinvest it not just in the people of Manchester, but they can also make sure that the effects of that are felt much more widely around the Greater Manchester region. But they've had to do it on a voluntary basis, because when they and Birmingham and others have gone to the Treasury and said we're fairly unique amongst major cities globally for not having the power to do this, they've just met with a closed door and closed minds. We're not, though, unaware that there are many areas where, particularly over the last 12 years, when we've seen a turbocharging of decline and money stripped out of our communities, that asking places to be more and more reliant on a local tax base, when that assets and that income has been stripped from many, many places and they've fallen further and further behind, could, if that was done wrongly, be a major drive of inequality. So it's a conversation that we've kick-started, and we are open-minded as to where that goes.
I mean, you did talk quite, I think, about decentralising radically and evenly. I think your point is uneven at the moment. But that Treasury orthodoxy, you know, I've been in government, I've seen what it does. We had very grand decentralisation ambitions in 2010 in the coalition. Fantastic if you really want to dig into policy wonkery in this area, decentralisation green paper produced by Greg Clark in 2011, you might remember it. And yet, it becomes so hard to keep winning that argument. So again, I come back to the sort of question is, how will you do it differently this time?
I was chatting to Jack Straw over the weekend, because if you remember under the last Labour government, there was this sort of, in the run-up to 1997, there was a proposal around regional assemblies and this sort of big political, it was meant to be a big political economic programme of devolution, not just the regional development agencies, which eventually materialised, which were, certainly in Yorkshire and in the Northwest were stunning success stories, but much more radical devolution than that. And I was chatting to him about how it all sort of collapsed into a much smaller, much less radical agenda. I think you're right about the Treasury orthodoxy that many people smash up against, and that's one of the reasons why, as you picked up on, the argument is economic, because we've got to, those of us who believe in this agenda have got to win the argument that it is better for our national economy if we do this, not just something that we deserve in many parts of the country. But he also reminded me that part of the reason that agenda collapsed was because, and there are different views on this. My view is that the offer that was on offer to the people of the North East through the referendum on a regional assembly was limited. It hadn't started at the bottom up, and it hadn't been built on the powers and the outcomes that people wanted to see in their own region. And he reminded me that it was one Dominic Cummings who'd actually come to run the campaign against that, who stood in the middle of Newcastle with a great big inflatable white elephant and saw off that agenda all those years ago. And it's sort of ironic, I suppose, that then all those years later, this vote to leave, I think, is driven by a lot of people in those places who feel that they lack the power to actually have, call it control if you like, to take back control over their own lives. So here we are, and we've come full circle, and we've got to seize the moment this time.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'd say two brief things on that, if I may. The first is that I think you're right about the either or and the false dichotomy between them. When we set up Centre for Towns, it was a direct challenge to the idea that investing in some places automatically lifts others, this idea of sort of trickle-out economics that just demonstrably has not worked for a lot of places around the country. But it wasn't an argument against cities. And for us, crucially, it was a bridging project to help take the experience of two groups of people in very different places who, as we started, I think Will started this conference by saying, you know, have largely in so many ways lost the ability to understand one another. And as we saw during Brexit, had lost the ability then to disagree well. But two very different experiences of globalisation over the last 40 years. And we wanted to find a way to bring that together so that we were bigger than the sum of all of our parts, so that no place or person was written off and that we could move forwards together. But the second thing I would say as well about the framing of the question, because I had a problem with it as well, was that it sort of relies on this idea, and don't underestimate how prevalent this is in some sections of politics. I heard a cabinet minister giving expression to this the other day when he said levelling up is about paying your own way. Don't underestimate how strong this idea is, that people, you know, you can either work hard and do it for yourself, or there can be a partner from government. For me, this was the tragedy, actually, of the big society. One of the most interesting set of ideas to emerge in British politics over recent decades is that by 2010, 2011, it sort of collapsed into an argument about shrinking the state. But it's not about there being no state. It's about the state doing something differently, because people do work hard. We already work hard. Most people in this country, I think, work harder than ever before. 2 jobs, shift work, struggling to see your family, but then find at the end of the week that they just simply can't make ends meet. There's something fundamentally broken in a modern economy where that's the case. And it's my view that it's because we've got a central government that is trying to micromanage millions of these decisions and not doing its actual job, which is to clear the pitch so that those people who build and create can get on with building and creating, and those people who extract and destroy and take are allowed to hoard far too much money and power in the system.
Yeah. We've got one more question. Good. Time for one more brief question, please. Thank you.
Gosh, well, I guess I mean, not to be too trite about it, but I'd say acknowledge the problem. That for too long we haven't acknowledged the problem, and that is partly because we've seen where we have taken a place-based approach, and my own party traditionally doesn't take a place-based approach. We've had lots of regeneration initiatives over the years.
Social mobility focused rather
than
we
tend to see things through the lens of people, not places. And people matter, but places matter too, because not least higher productivity is associated with higher living standards. So if you write off the place, you write off the people in it, or most of them at least. So acknowledge the problem, that there is a problem, that seeing this through the lens of regions masks huge disparities between what is happening within regions, and then start to respond. Good jobs, you know, you said to me, is this really the core? But it is in the end, because those good jobs where you can raise a family on, where you can make a contribution, those are the things that young people seek. My own town in Wigan is not unusual, where we still have young people who are the first in their family to go to university. Massive expansion of higher education, the education maintenance allowance that got them through those tricky couple of years at college when their families couldn't afford for them to carry on. Amazing, game-changing opportunities to go to university, but when they look back, too often they find there's too little to return home to. And then around that, it creates the investment and the assets that allow you to build all the things that you need. The decent housing, you're an architect, I mean, you'll know this better than I do, but the sort of housing that young people want to live in and can raise families in. So, you know, policies like the bedroom tax, they're not just a disaster because they do so much damage to people. They're a disaster for us because it meant that lots of people had to move out of the secure family homes that we'd built into the private rented sector, away from friends and family, away from social assets, because we just simply didn't have that sort of housing stock. And the arts and culture, and I should say something nice about the Arts Council because I think they're here. And when I was extremely rude about the Arts Council in Parliament a few years ago, and I realised that large parts of the country had been written off. And I got a call from the Chief Executive that day, and they've come not just to Halifax, but to Wigan and to many other parts of the country. They've changed the way that they fund. They're funding us through the rugby league institution that we have in our town. I'm going to win the Challenge Cup on Saturday. And we're, you know, they're back and they're active, but they're partners, and they're enabling us to realise our vision for our places, not imposing that vision from offices in Whitehall. That's what the future of this country looks like, I think. And I have every confidence that we can build it, but it relies on some people who don't see it to get out the way and let us get on with it.
Lisa, thank you very much for a superb speech this morning, for being with us. And I think what all of us can gain from that is just how much thought and passion you devote to this topic. And whoever is in charge after the next election, we know that this agenda is going to go from... We'll see.